Every mammal roughly your size is nocturnal. Rats, raccoons, foxes, most of the primates your ancestors evolved alongside, active at night, asleep by day. You aren't. Your species broke the pattern. And the reason isn't that daylight was safer. For most of human history, daylight was when the real predators were watching. So why did we do the opposite of almost every other mammal our size? This is one of those questions that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it, and then it turns into one of the strangest unsolved puzzles in the story of how we became human. Because being awake in daylight and asleep at night, completely blind, completely still, completely defenseless, for 8 hours at a stretch, is not the safe option. It's the reckless one, and your body still carries the fingerprints of the switch that made it happen. Let's start with the baseline, because most people don't actually know what that baseline was. Go back roughly 65 million years before the earliest primates even existed, and you land in the age of the dinosaurs. Mammals at that point were small, fast, and almost universally nocturnal. Not by preference, by necessity. The daytime world belonged to reptiles and eventually to the dinosaurs that dominated it. Mammals survived by doing the one thing their reptilian competitors couldn't do particularly well, operating in the dark. Warm blood, whiskers, sharp hearing, a nose built for tracking scent trails in pitch black. Every early mammal was, in a very real sense, a night shift worker. This wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was survival by scheduling. Share the world with something bigger and more dangerous, and the easiest way to avoid it is to be active when it isn't. This is called the nocturnal bottleneck, and it left a permanent mark on mammalian biology, including yours. Look at the anatomy mammals inherited from this period. Reduced color vision compared to reptiles and birds, because color vision is largely useless in darkness. A heavy reliance on smell. Whiskers for spatial awareness in low light. Even the structure of the mammalian eye, built around light-sensitive rod cells rather than color-sensitive cone cells, is a night shift eye. Most mammals alive today are still nocturnal, or at least twilight active. Roughly two-thirds of all mammal species still operate primarily in darkness. Nocturnality isn't the exception in the mammal family tree. It's closer to the default setting. You are the exception. So somewhere in the branch of the family tree that eventually produced primates, and then eventually produced you, something shifted. And to understand why, we need to talk about what happened after the dinosaurs disappeared. Once the mass extinction event 66 million years ago cleared the daytime world of its dominant predators, mammals had an opportunity they'd never had before. Daylight was suddenly available, empty, unclaimed, and a subset of mammals, the early ancestors of primates among them, started to move into it. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the shift wasn't universal and it wasn't instant. Different primate lineages made this transition at different points, using different biological tools to pull it off. Some primates, like most lemurs today, stayed nocturnal. Others, the ancestors of monkeys, apes, and eventually us, gradually became diurnal, active by day. And the tool that made this switch possible wasn't courage or intelligence, it was color vision. Here's the mechanism. Diurnal life is only worth living if you can actually see well during the day, and specifically, if you can see well enough to find food that a nocturnal animal would miss. Early daytime primates developed trichromatic color vision, the ability to distinguish red, green, and blue wavelengths with real precision. This wasn't cosmetic, it was a foraging upgrade. Ripe fruit against green foliage, young, nutrient-dense leaves against older ones. Trichromatic vision let daytime primates spot food that monochromatic nocturnal eyes simply couldn't detect efficiently. Once that advantage existed, daylight stopped being empty territory and started being valuable territory, worth the risk of exposure. But notice what this means. The switch to daytime activity in primates wasn't primarily about escaping predators. It was about food. Predator avoidance was the cost of the trade, not the reason for it, which raises an obvious problem, because daylight didn't just offer better food. It also offered better visibility to everything that wanted to eat you. This is where the second half of the story kicks in, and it's the half that almost never gets discussed. Early diurnal primates paid for their new food access with a massive increase in exposure to daytime predators. Eagles and other raptors with vision built specifically for daylight hunting, big cats, snakes that hunt visually rather than by scent, striking during daylight hours when their prey is easiest to track. The fossil and behavioral record shows the fingerprints of this pressure everywhere in primate biology. Group living, one of the most defining features of primate social structure, appears to have been driven substantially by daytime predator pressure. More eyes scanning the tree line means a predator gets spotted sooner. Alarm calls, a communication system present across nearly every diurnal primate species studied, exists specifically because daytime predation created a survival advantage for animals that could warn each other fast. Even something as basic as primate vision, forward-facing eyes providing excellent depth perception, is partly a daytime predator detection adaptation, useful for judging exactly how far away that leopard actually is before you decide whether to run. So primates didn't become daytime animals because daytime was safer. They became daytime animals because daytime had better food, and then spent millions of years evolving increasingly sophisticated ways to survive the predators that came with it. Safety wasn't the starting condition, it was the ongoing negotiation. Now fast forward to the hominin lineage specifically, because this is where the story gets even stranger, and where the myth most people carry around, that cavemen huddled in fear of the dark night after night, starts to fall apart under real scrutiny. Early hominins inherited the diurnal baseline from their primate ancestors, but they also did something almost no other primate had done. They moved out of the forest canopy and onto the open savanna, into an environment with dramatically less overhead cover and dramatically more large predators, actively hunting at every hour, not just during the day. Lions, hyenas, and leopards in particular are highly active at night, and early hominins on the ground, without claws, without significant size, without the option of climbing to safety the way their tree-dwelling ancestors could, should have been catastrophically vulnerable after dark. And for a long stretch of hominin history, they probably were. This is one of the more genuinely uncomfortable conclusions in paleoanthropology. Before controlled use of fire became widespread, nighttime for early hominins was almost certainly a period of extreme vulnerability, managed primarily through avoidance. Sleep in defensible locations, sleep in groups, for the same collective vigilance reasons primates had relied on for millions of years already. Minimize movement after dark, because movement in low light with limited night vision, compared to the specialized nocturnal predators sharing the landscape, was an enormous risk. Early hominins weren't nocturnal, and they also weren't comfortable creatures of the night. They were diurnal animals doing their best to survive nighttime as a recurring, unavoidable threat window, the same way a diurnal primate today has to survive it. This is genuinely different from how most people imagine it. The popular image is cavemen around a fire, safe and cozy night after night for the entire span of human evolution. The reality is that for a huge stretch of hominin history, there was no fire. There was just darkness, and predators that could see and smell and hear far better in it than any hominin could, and a group of primates doing everything possible to simply get through until sunrise. Which brings us to the single biggest turning point in this entire story: fire. Controlled use of fire changed the fundamental math of nighttime survival, and it's difficult to overstate how completely it rewired the relationship between hominins and darkness. Once a group could reliably keep a fire burning through the night, several things happened simultaneously. Predators that would otherwise approach a sleeping group at night are demonstrably deterred by fire, avoiding it consistently across studied populations and species. Fire provided light, which meant hominins could actually see threats approaching, instead of relying purely on sound and smell in total darkness. And fire provided warmth, which mattered enormously as hominins spread into colder climates, where nighttime temperature drops were themselves a survival threat, independent of predation. Archaeological evidence for controlled fire use goes back at least a million years, with some contested evidence pushing that timeline even earlier, and its effects on hominin behavior appear to have been substantial and fast. Once fire became a reliable nighttime tool, the calculation around darkness shifted from pure avoidance toward active management. You didn't need to simply survive the night anymore. You could hold a defensible position within it, but here's the part that almost nobody talks about, and it's arguably the most important consequence of controlled fire in this entire story. Fire didn't just make nighttime survivable, it created the conditions for something that hadn't existed before: extended, reliable, socially shared wakeful time after dark in a controlled, well-lit space with nothing urgent left to do. Think about what a normal day looked like before fire. Wake at first light, forage, hunt, move, work, essentially every waking hour dedicated to the direct business of staying alive. Then darkness falls, and there's genuinely nothing productive or safe left to do, so the group goes still, huddles, and waits for morning. Fire broke that pattern completely. For the first time, hominins had a stretch of time, every single night, that wasn't dedicated to immediate survival tasks, and wasn't spent in frightened stillness either. It was lit, it was warm, it was defensible, and it was, for the first time in the history of the hominin lineage, available for something else entirely. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have found something remarkable about what actually happens around a fire after dark, and it's almost certainly a window into an extremely old pattern. Daytime conversation in these groups is overwhelmingly practical. Logistics, complaints, coordination, the business of getting through the day. Nighttime conversation around a fire is different. It shifts dramatically towards storytelling, myth, social bonding, information about people not present, and cultural transmission. The deliberate passing of knowledge, history, and values from older members of the group to younger ones. Firelight didn't just make nighttime survivable. It appears to have created one of the very first dedicated social and cultural spaces in human history, a time and place every single day set aside specifically for the transmission of everything that makes a culture rather than just a survival strategy. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it means the switch away from nocturnal vulnerability didn't just protect hominins physically. It may have built the scaffolding for language, storytelling, and cultural transmission as we understand them. The campfire wasn't a cozy detail in the background of prehistoric life. It was possibly one of the most important pieces of infrastructure our species ever built, and it only existed because hominins had spent millions of years as vulnerable daytime animals looking for a way to finally win the argument with the dark. By the way, if this kind of thing genuinely fascinates you, I go a lot deeper into the hidden mechanisms behind ancient human survival, what they feared, how they adapted, what almost killed our entire species more than once, in my full course, The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, plus an exclusive PDF guide. Links in the description if you want to go further down this particular rabbit hole. Now let's talk about what's still left over in you from all of this, because the switch away from true nocturnality was never total, and the leftover fragments are stranger than most people realize. Humans still retain a functional, if severely diminished, version of night vision, using the same rod cell dominant retinal structure inherited from that ancient nocturnal mammalian bottleneck 65 million years ago. It's nowhere near as capable as a genuinely nocturnal animal's vision, but it's there, and it kicks in automatically the moment ambient light drops, your pupils dilating, your rod cells taking over from your far less light-sensitive cone cells in a process called dark adaptation that can take upwards of 20 minutes to fully complete. That 20-minute lag is itself a fossil. It's the echo of an ancestor who didn't need to adapt quickly to darkness, because darkness was simply the default operating condition, not an occasional inconvenience. There's also the well-documented human tendency toward heightened anxiety and impaired risk assessment in darkness, even in objectively safe modern environments. Studies on human behavior in low-light conditions consistently find elevated startle responses, increased perceived threat, and impaired spatial reasoning after dark, even indoors, even in familiar spaces, even when there is no rational reason for concern. This isn't superstition. It's very plausibly a direct behavioral remnant of a few million years spent as a diurnal primate, whose ancestors paid a steep price for underestimating what might be out there once the sun went down. And then there's melatonin, sleep architecture, and the modern collision between an ancient biological clock and artificial light, which is really the final chapter of this story and arguably the most relevant one to your actual daily life. Human circadian biology, the internal clock regulating sleep, alertness, and dozens of other physiological processes, evolved under conditions of a genuinely dark night, uninterrupted by anything brighter than starlight, moonlight, or eventually firelight, for the overwhelming majority of the last several million years. That biological clock has no evolutionary experience whatsoever, with a modern night flooded with electric light, screens, and street light. The result is a species biologically calibrated for a night that essentially no longer exists in most of the developed world, still running the same ancient scheduling software on hardware, surrounded by an environment that software was never built to handle. So here's where this actually leaves us. Your ancestors didn't become daytime creatures because daylight was safe. They became daytime creatures chasing better food, and then spent millions of years surviving the predators that decision exposed them to. For a long stretch of that history, nighttime wasn't cozy. It was a threat window managed through group vigilance and sheer avoidance. The same uneasy truce every diurnal primate before them had struck with the dark. And then, for the first time in that entire multi-million-year negotiation, fire gave your ancestors something they'd never had: the ability to sit up after dark, together, lit and warm and watched over, and simply talk, not survive. Talk, tell stories, pass down what they knew to the people who'd need it after they were gone. You still carry every piece of that history. The rod cells doing their slow 20-minute handoff in a darkened room. The uneasy prickle of walking down an unlit street even when you know, rationally, that nothing is out there. The circadian clock ticking out a rhythm that was built for a night with nothing but firelight in it, now running underneath a modern world of blue-lit screens it was never designed to process. You're not scared of the dark because you're irrational. You're scared of the dark because for millions of years, the individuals who weren't scared enough didn't get the chance to pass that trait on. And every time you finally close your eyes for the night, safe and warm, and completely, uniquely unlike almost every other mammal your size, you're doing something your ancestors spent an almost unimaginable span of time fighting, adapting, and slowly, carefully, earning the right to do.